There are some images that simply can't be expunged from the mind's eye once they've been seen. Certain pictures so overbearingly grotesque that they burn their image onto the retina, and one is unable to look away from the horror. Sometimes these images sneak in unnoticed on young, impressionable minds. Perhaps they're from different, older times, and they've been smuggled in and seemingly domesticated. And yet these vignettes that had previously been deemed innocuous wreak havoc on some of our most vulnerable populations. I know this because there's a particular image that's plagued me since I was young, when I saw it flipping through one of my children's books. On this spring day, when we celebrate new life and fertility with fresh flowers and the omnipresence of eggs, chocolate, dyed and otherwise, there's an imposter, a wolf in sheep's clothing among us. It's the granddaddy of all eggs, but it's not a symbol of new life and resurrection. No, quite the opposite. It's a sign of irredeemable death, destruction, and decay. It's a metaphor for when we simply can't fix something or mend it. Of course, I'm speaking about Humpty Dumpty. Yes, that Humpty Dumpty, who sat on a wall, that Humpty Dumpty who had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty back together again. What seems like an innocuous nursery rhyme for kids is actually a silent terror. I encountered my childhood fears afresh this week as I listened to the recent episode of the radio broadcast and podcast, This American Life. This episode titled All the King's Horses, in which Ira Glass, the host, discovers from some of his co-workers who have little children just how unsettling Humpty Dumpty is to some of those kids. Laura said that at the doctor's office they have this giant poster, and their 2-year-old saw it, and after that was like, someone can break and not go back together? Another co-worker's son, Max, after seeing the image, would whine for hours and incessantly cry, I want to tell him to go back together. Back together. A This American Life media post about Humpty Dumpty went viral, with loads of parents commenting on how terrified their kids were. One said her preschooler couldn't stand to watch her crack eggs in the kitchen because it reminded her of the terror of that simple nursery rhyme. Another 2-year-old spent weeks asking if he could try and recreate that story with an egg from the fridge, which of course they did, like a few dozen times, puzzling over the impossibility of putting an egg back together once it's cracked. And others reflected on just how inappropriate it is to invite children to picture poor Humpty Dumpty left there in pieces on the side of the road with a sad, resigned look on his face. A woman named Isabella wrote this: I wonder if he had to exist conscious in his cracked state forever in suspended animation, or if rather he died slowly, aware of his mortal wound. Because it seems he was quite alive after he cracked. There's something about that image of someone broken so badly that nothing can fix it, that things can go wrong, and that finally, before you understand all the bad things that can happen in the world, how things come apart, how people you love can die, and how you will too die, before any of that entropic, messy chaos of our world really comes into consciousness, you get this glimpse of this fat cartoon, overdressed Eggman smashed to tiny bits of shell and goo right in front of you. and you sing happy songs about it. It's an image that once seen cannot be unseen. In today's gospel story from John, we hear that early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb. I suspect that Mary arrives at the tomb haunted by her own grotesque images that she herself witnessed just 3 days prior. An image of deep humiliation and tragic, irreconcilable death of her beloved friend and master, Jesus. And this image must be plaguing her as she arrives only to see that the stone has been removed from the tomb. She had witnessed and experienced one of the most heart-rending, heartbreaking images a few days earlier, and I could only imagine that it still filled her with dread, fear, and anxiety. She couldn't simply unsee it. Everything she now observes is filtered through that image of futile fragility and cruel corruptibility. She sees the empty tomb and can only conclude that it's not over. The humiliation will continue. That someone has stolen away the body of her loved one, desecrating even his grave, his memory. And so she determines that the unknown yet ubiquitous forces that she calls they are at it again, now tormenting Jesus' lifeless body, turning it into a spectacle. So she runs to tell the other disciples, and Peter and John return with her to look at the tomb. John's the faster runner of the two. What they see is puzzling. The linen cloths left behind, but no body. No evidence of anyone tampering with Jesus' body. Now a new image that suggests the impossible. Is it possible that perhaps death and corruption don't have the final word? But I'm not sure they can even see that particular image for what it is. No, they have a different image burned into their mind's eyes of state torture, of their own lives tenuously held in the balance. And so the male disciples do what men sometimes do: run away, back to the security of their homes. But Mary stays to grieve. No matter how much she cries, she can't purge that finality of that image from her eyes, of her dying friend. 2 angels appear on the scene, and still she can't see past the image in her mind. Jesus himself magically is there, and she can't see it. She can't look past what she knows to be true. Both parties tenderly ask her, "Woman, why are you crying?" But her explanation shows that she can't see beyond that image etched into her brain. All she sees is death. All she smells is death. All she feels is dread. She can't even see the miraculous that's manifestly present right there in front of her. So disquieted is her heart, and so disturbed her vision, that she looks right at Jesus and doesn't recognize him. It isn't until he says her name that she finally sees the reality of the resurrection. Like Mary, I fear that many of us are blinded by our own fear and grief and are unable to see the possibility of renewal and resurrection happening in the midst of our lives. We're too worried by those health conditions, too worried about the state of the world, wars here and there. What will happen as my children grow? Is there a future for my grandchildren? It isn't until that moment that Mary's name is said that she awakens. But I fear that many of us still live the life of Humpty Dumpty and continue to exist conscious of our cracked states of being, believing that we are forever flawed. We accept the broken nature of ourselves and others and the world. When relationships fall apart or adversity rises, we fatalistically conclude, that's it. That's the end of the story. Nothing will ever change. We willingly accept the humiliation and heartbreak handed out by those unknown yet ubiquitous forces that we often call they or them. We simply can't or won't muster the will or the ability to see past the image of failure perpetually etched in our mind's eye. Those secret voices that tell us we're not good enough, that we're a mess up. Life, the resurrected life, is calling out to each of us this morning. It's calling us each by name and begging us to open our eyes and see. You know, I think it might be instructive that Mary can only see Jesus, only see the reality of the new resurrected life once she listens, once she hears her name called. What if resurrection can't be seen before it's heard? What if resurrection can't be seen before it's heard? Pause for a moment and just listen. Listening is a far different modality than seeing. For in hearing, we must actively wait and patiently receive. With hands open, with ears open. Whereas with sight, we quickly grab and compose an image. I think it's telling that we can close our eyes, but we can't close our ears. Indeed, the Swiss theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar wrote this about the difference between seeing and listening. The eye is the organ with which the world is possessed and dominated, grabbed, if you will. The immediate reflection in the sphere of the senses of the rational intellect that comprehends. Though through the eye, the world is our world, in which we are not lost, rather it is subordinate to us as an immeasurable dwelling place with which we are familiar. Or in other words, we dominate the world by our sight. And sometimes our sight dominates us. We are unable to open to the work of the indwelling Spirit, to hear, to listen to how things might just be different. I don't know what you've been living through, or what horrors you have seen, or what image is etched on your mind's eye. But I think that our visions are habitually clouded by death, failure, and destruction. It's difficult, if not impossible, to see the power of God's resurrection. So in this season of resurrection, I invite you to stop looking and start listening. God is calling you, speaking your name. You are not broken. You are not beyond repair. God created you and called you good, very good. Yes, God is calling your name and breathing the power of the resurrection into your life. If you listen, I think you might just hear God breathing. As the wind blows, listen, for it is God's Spirit whispering to you, telling you that there is more to the story. God is telling you of your true nature, not the lies you're led to believe. What you are is God's gift to you. What you become is your gift to God. Keep your eyes peeled and your ears open, for your story is not complete. Our story is not complete. Even the story of Humpty Dumpty is not so final or clear-cut. Behind that nursery rhyme, and the pastels of the accompanying pictures, there was a real Humpty Dumpty. According to a number of military historians, Humpty Dumpty was the name of a cannon used by the Royalists during the English Civil War. If you know your history, you know the conflict raged from 1642 to 1649. Very influential in the Church of England, so all of us priests know all about this stuff. Although I didn't know about Humpty Dumpty. So the Puritans routed the Royalists, and that the beginning of the end occurred on June 1648, when Humpty Dumpty was stationed on the walls of Colchester. It was one of several cannons erected to try and keep Parliament's army from taking the city, the last stronghold. The next month, however, the parliamentary forces heavily damaged the walls beneath Humpty Dumpty with their own artillery. And you can guess where this is going. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall and broke into pieces down at the base of the wall. As for the business of all the king's horses and all the king's men, it seems those lines are rather literal. The Royalists, or the Cavaliers, were very much the king's men, fighting in support of King Charles I, who would go on to lose the war and his head, paving the path for Oliver Cromwell to take over and rule the United Kingdom as Lord Protector. It's easy to think the story ends there. Broken cannon, broken eggs, and the end of a kingdom. And yet we know that stories continue, even when we can't fathom a possible future. And yet one story always seems to emerge, impossible as it may seem. Just as we saw last year at his coronation, England still has a King Charles. The resurrection is a reminder that no matter how bleak things look, no matter how hard your back is pressed to the wall, no how assured the outcomes are, even after all the Hail Marys have been said or thrown, the story is never over. God's Spirit continues to call forth a new future, resurrecting out of death life, a new way of being, even though we can't even fathom or imagine it. And we certainly can't see it. But maybe, if you listen, I think you may just hear God calling your name. Amen.